Look at this. Right now behind me, on a balcony that measures barely 4 feet by 6 feet, I have just tipped over a plastic storage bin. And what came out of it? Honestly, it still surprises me every single time. Not a handful of sad, tiny marble-sized potatoes. I am talking about a pile of huge, beautiful tubers. Some of them are the size of my open hand, all grown in a cheap plastic container, with ordinary potting soil, on a paved terrace in the middle of a city. No field, no tractor, no deep garden beds, no magic. And the best part is that you can do exactly the same thing, starting this week, even if you have never grown a single plant in your life. Now, I know exactly what you might be thinking right now. Probably something like, sure, another internet gardening miracle. Another crop that works only in some perfect Mediterranean climate with professional lighting, and a gardener who spends 6 hours a day fussing over it. I completely understand that reaction. I had it myself for years. I grew up thinking potatoes were a serious, large-scale crop. Something you planted in long, straight rows in a proper field, hilled the soil up around the stems, waited a whole season, and then dug up with a big fork. The idea of growing them on a terrace seemed almost absurd. And then I saw it done, in the most ordinary, unglamorous way possible, by someone who was not trying to impress anyone. And that is when the whole thing clicked. The reason you have likely never been told this is honestly kind of annoying. It works too well, and costs too little for anyone to make much money selling you the idea. There is no expensive kit required, no proprietary fertilizer, no special variety of seed potato that only one company supplies. It is just a container, some soil, and a potato. That is it. The entire commercial gardening world would much rather sell you a complicated raised bed system, a bag of specialty compost, a drip irrigation timer, and a liquid feed schedule that looks like a chemistry syllabus. And sure, those things can work. But they are not necessary. People have been growing potatoes in small spaces for centuries, in sacks, in barrels, in old bathtubs, in piles of straw. The old way has always worked. We just stopped doing it because it looked too simple to be credible. Let me ask you something. Hand on heart, how many of you have a terrace, a balcony, a small paved yard, or even just a sunny strip of concrete by the front door, and you have told yourself that growing your own food there is impossible? Maybe you have tried a few pots of herbs, a tomato plant that gave you 3 fruit, a sad little lettuce that bolted in the heat. And after that, you gave up on the idea of anything substantial. I get it. I have been there. For a good 15 years I grew things in small spaces, and for a long time I avoided potatoes entirely because I assumed they needed too much depth, too much space, too much patience. And every spring I would see seed potatoes for sale and think, one day, when I have a real garden. That is the exact moment I now regret. Because the truth is that a single potato, planted in a simple container, can turn into a serious harvest. And you do not need to wait for a real garden. You already have everything you need. Before I show you exactly how to do it, let me just clear away the usual advice you have probably already heard, because most of it is either wrong or unnecessarily complicated. First, there is the classic recommendation to buy a special potato growing bag. You know the ones, fabric or plastic, sold in garden centers for a ridiculous price. They work, I will give them that. But they are not magic. They are just a container with drainage holes. You can make something just as good for a fraction of the cost, and I will show you how in a minute. Second, there is the advice to use a deep, heavy wooden planter, which will cost you a small fortune in wood and soil, and then you will have to move it, which will ruin your back. It is like building a barn to keep one chicken. Technically it works, but it is not a reasonable solution for a terrace. Third, there is the idea that you need to keep adding more and more soil as the plant grows, a process called hilling, which is fine in a field, but in a container it just means you started with the container too empty. And fourth, there is the most annoying advice of all, which is to use loose straw or wood chips instead of soil, which sounds lovely and rustic until you realize that potatoes grown in pure straw often end up small and green because they are not getting the consistent moisture and nutrition they need. It looks great on social media. It is not the best way to get huge tubers. So let me tell you how I finally learned this. I have a neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Kowalska, who has been growing potatoes on her balcony for over 20 years. Every summer, she would bring over a few, just casually in a plastic bag, as if it were nothing. And they were enormous. Clean, smooth, beautiful potatoes. For years I assumed she had some secret, some old country trick she was keeping to herself. Then one spring I asked her directly, and she laughed at me. She said, "There is no secret. You just plant them in a big bucket and leave them alone." And then she showed me her setup. It was so simple that I almost did not believe it. A few large plastic pots, some cheap potting mix, a bit of fertilizer, and potatoes. That was it. The only thing she was strict about was the size of the container and the amount of sun. Everything else, she said, the potato does by itself. So now I am going to share the whole thing with you, exactly as she showed me, with the small changes I have made through trial and error. And before you ask, no, this is not a secret variety from the old country. You can use ordinary seed potatoes from any garden center, or even organic potatoes from the grocery store if you cannot find seed potatoes. The method matters more than the variety. Here is the reveal, plain and simple. The so-called secret to growing lots of huge, beautiful potatoes on a terrace is nothing more than a deep container with good drainage, ordinary potting mix, and the habit of leaving the plant alone at the right time. That is the whole idea. You do not need a field. You do not need a special bag. You do not need a greenhouse. You need a container that holds at least 10 to 15 gallons of soil, because potatoes form along the buried stem, and the more stem you can bury, the more potatoes you get. You need soil that drains well but holds moisture, because potatoes are mostly water and they bulk up fast when they never dry out and never sit in soggy mud. And you need to stop fussing over them, because the plant knows what it is doing. The cost for all of this, if you are starting from nothing, is under $15. Less than a single lunch from a drive-thru. And the container can be used again year after year. Let me give you the absolute specifics, because I know that is what you actually need. You want a container that is at least 18 inches deep and roughly 18 to 20 inches wide. That is about a 15-gallon pot. You can use a large plastic nursery pot, a heavy-duty storage tote, a 5-gallon bucket if you must, but honestly bigger is better, a fabric grow bag or even a burlap sack. Whatever you use, it must have drainage holes in the bottom. If it does not, drill or cut at least 5 or 6 holes, each about the size of your thumb. Potatoes rot in standing water, and rot is the one thing that will ruin your entire harvest. For soil, use a good quality potting mix, not garden soil from the ground, because garden soil compacts in containers and turns into concrete. You can buy a 2-cubic-foot bag of ordinary potting mix for about $8. You will also want a slow-release granular fertilizer, the kind meant for vegetables, about a handful per container. And that is it. 1 container, 1 bag of soil, 1 handful of fertilizer, and 3 or 4 seed potatoes. Total cost, as I said, under $15, and most of that is the soil. Now let me walk you through the whole process step by step, because the order matters, and there are a couple of mistakes that most beginners make. The first mistake is planting too early in the season. Potatoes do not need to be planted in January. They need soil that has warmed up a bit, usually around the time the last frost has passed in your area, which for most of us is mid to late spring. If you plant too early, the seed potato will sit in cold, wet soil and rot before it ever sprouts. I made this mistake once, years ago, in my eagerness to get started. I planted a whole container in March, during a week of unseasonably warm weather, and then the cold returned. 3 weeks later, I dug around in the soil to check on them, and the seed pieces were soft and foul-smelling, already turning to mush. That was a hard lesson, and it cost me an entire container of soil and a handful of good seed potatoes. Now I wait until the nights are consistently above freezing, and the soil in the container feels just slightly warm to the touch, like a bath that has cooled a little too much to be comfortable. Patience at the start is the first discipline of growing potatoes. Second, prepare the seed potatoes. If you have large seed potatoes, cut them into pieces, each piece with at least 2 or 3 eyes, those little dimples where the sprouts will emerge. Let the cut pieces sit on the kitchen counter for a day or 2, so the cut side dries and forms a callus. This is important because a fresh cut potato planted directly in moist soil is an open invitation to rot. The callus is like a scab over a wound. It seals the flesh and keeps the soil organisms out. If you skip this step, you are gambling. Sometimes you get lucky, and the piece still grows. Other times, the whole thing dissolves into a foul-smelling puddle, and you have to start over. If you have small seed potatoes, the size of a golf ball, plant them whole. No cutting needed. Third, fill the container about 1/3 of the way up with moist potting mix. Not dry, not soggy, just slightly damp like a wrung-out sponge. Mix the slow-release fertilizer into that bottom third of soil, because you want the nutrients down where the roots will reach them, not sitting on the surface. Place 3 or 4 seed potato pieces on top of that soil, evenly spaced, with the eyes facing up. Then cover them with another 3 or 4 inches of soil. That is it. Do not fill the container to the top right away. That is the second big mistake. If you fill it completely at planting time, the stem has nowhere to grow before it reaches the light, and you lose the chance to bury more of it later. Potatoes form along the buried stem, so every inch of stem you bury is more potential potatoes. Now here is the part that surprises people. Once the plant starts growing and the green shoots are about 6 to 8 inches tall, you add more soil to the container, burying the lower half of the stem. Leave the top leaves exposed. Then you do it again a few weeks later, and maybe one more time, until the container is filled to within an inch or 2 of the rim. Each time you bury the stem, the plant responds by producing more stolons, those underground stems that swell at the tips into potatoes. This is the same principle as hilling in a field, but in a container it is much easier because you are just adding soil to a pot. Do not pack the soil down hard. Just add it loosely and let it settle. And do not water right after hilling with a strong jet, because you will wash the soil away from the stem. Water gently. Watering is the third place where people go wrong. Potatoes in containers need consistent moisture, but they hate sitting in soggy soil. The rule is simple. Stick your finger into the soil up to the second knuckle. If it feels dry, water slowly until water runs out of the drainage holes. If it feels damp, do nothing. In hot weather on a sunny terrace, you may need to water every day, sometimes twice a day in a heat wave. In cool weather, maybe every 3 or 4 days. The goal is to never let the soil dry out completely, and never let it stay waterlogged. If the plants wilt in the afternoon but recover in the evening, that is often just heat stress, not lack of water. Check the soil before you water. If it is still damp, leave it alone. Too much water is more dangerous than too little, because it causes the tubers to rot from the inside. Sunlight is the fourth thing. Potatoes need full sun, which means at least 6 hours of direct sunlight a day, and more is better. On a terrace, that usually means the sunniest corner you have, often against a south or west-facing wall. If your space is partially shaded, you will still get a harvest, but the tubers will be smaller and fewer. If you have a choice between morning sun and afternoon sun is stronger and better for bulking up the tubers. But any direct sun is good. Do not put them in a shady corner and expect huge tubers. It will not happen. Fertilizing is simple. Because you mixed a slow-release fertilizer into the soil at planting time, and because you keep adding fresh soil as you hill, you may not need to fertilize again at all. The fresh soil itself provides nutrients. If you notice the leaves turning pale or yellowing early in the season, you can water once with a diluted liquid vegetable fertilizer, mixed at half the strength on the label. Do not overdo it. Too much nitrogen gives you huge green tops and tiny tubers. The plant puts all its energy into leaves instead of potatoes. That is the fifth mistake, and it is very common. People think more fertilizer means more potatoes. It does not. It means more leaves. Potatoes need a balanced diet, not a feast. Now let me explain why this works, because once you understand the mechanism, you will never forget it. A potato plant is a stem plant. The part we eat is not a root. It is a modified underground stem called a tuber. The plant stores energy in these tubers as a survival strategy. When the stem is buried, the plant senses the darkness and moisture and responds by sending out horizontal stems, the stolons, from the buried nodes. At the tips of these stolons, the plant deposits starch and water, swelling them into tubers. The more buried stem you have, the more nodes, the more stolons, the more tubers. That is why hilling works. It is not magic. It is just giving the plant more underground real estate. The container simulates the deep, loose, dark soil that potatoes love. In a field, we hill the soil up around the stems. In a container, we add soil from above. The principle is identical. The plant does not care whether it is in a field or a pot. It only cares about the conditions around its buried stem. The other mechanism is moisture. Potatoes are roughly 80% water. A tuber that grows in soil that goes through wet and dry cycles will crack, or it will be small and dense. A tuber that grows in soil that stays consistently moist, but not soggy, will expand smoothly and evenly, and it will size up fast. On a terrace, because the container is above ground, the soil warms up faster in spring, which gives the plant an earlier start, and the drainage holes prevent the roots from sitting in water, which prevents rot. The container also makes it easy to control the soil, because you are not dealing with whatever clay or sand is in your yard. You are giving the plant the exact medium it wants from day one. So what can you actually expect? Let me give you my real numbers, not inflated internet numbers. Last season, I planted 4 seed potatoes in a 15-gallon container on my terrace. I hilled twice, watered when the soil was dry, and otherwise left them alone. At the end of the season, when the plants had flowered and then started to yellow and die back, I tipped the whole container over onto a tarp. The harvest was just under 11 pounds of potatoes. That is from 4 seed potatoes in one container. The largest tubers were over half a pound each. Now, 11 pounds of potatoes is not going to feed a family for a month. But it is a real, substantial harvest from a space the size of a coffee table. And the best part is the taste. A potato dug and cooked the same day is a completely different food from a potato that has been in storage for 6 months. If you have never eaten a fresh potato, I am telling you, it is worth the entire experiment just for that. If you want to scale up, the system is modular. You can run 3 or 4 containers along a sunny wall. You can stagger your planting by 3 or 4 weeks, so you have a continuous harvest from late summer into autumn. You can experiment with different varieties, early ones for new potatoes, main crop ones for big storage tubers. You can even grow them in a pile of compost if you have a corner for it. But the core method does not change. Deep container, good drainage, ordinary potting mix, hilling as the stem grows, consistent moisture, full sun, and patience. That is the whole idea. Now there is one more thing I want to address, because I know someone will ask. Are potatoes grown in plastic containers safe? Yes, as long as the container is food grade or was not used for chemicals. A new plastic pot, a new storage tote, a fabric grow bag, all perfectly fine. If you are reusing an old container, wash it out with soap and water first, and avoid anything that held paint, motor oil, or other chemicals. The plant does not take up microplastics from the container into the tuber. The potato forms underground, surrounded by soil, and the skin is a barrier. Wash your potatoes before cooking, as you would with any potato, and you are fine. The same goes for the potting mix. Use a good quality mix, not something that has been sitting out in the rain for years and might be full of weed seeds or pathogens. Fresh soil, clean container, healthy plants. The thing that gets me every time is how close this knowledge came to being lost. For generations, people grew potatoes in small spaces as a matter of course. City dwellers, people with tiny yards, people with only a balcony, they all knew how to do this. They did not call it container gardening. They just called it growing food. Then somewhere along the way, we got convinced that food comes from the store, and that growing it requires a farm, or at least a big suburban yard with raised beds and a drip irrigation system. And so we stopped teaching each other the simple ways. We stopped passing down the knowledge that a potato, a bucket, and a bag of soil can feed you. It is not a new discovery. It is a very old skill, and it is still there, waiting for us to pick it up again. So here is what I want you to do. This week, go to any garden center, or a hardware store, or even online. Get 1 large container, at least 15 gallons, with drainage holes. Get 1 bag of ordinary potting mix. Get a handful of seed potatoes. Plant them exactly as I described. Put the container in the sunniest spot you have. Water it when the soil is dry. Hill it as the stem grows. And then in a few months, when the plants start to yellow and die back, tip the whole thing over and see what you have. I promise you, the moment you see those first big tubers roll out of the soil, you will understand why I am so enthusiastic about this. It is not about saving money, though you will. It is not about being a prepper, though it does not hurt. It is about the quiet satisfaction of pulling your own food out of a bucket on your own terrace, and knowing that you could do it again and again, forever. If this was useful, share it with someone who has a sunny balcony and thinks they cannot grow anything. That is how the old knowledge comes back, one person at a time. And if you want to see the whole process from planting to harvest, stick around, because I will show you exactly what it looks like at every stage. Now go get yourself a bucket and a potato. Seriously, that is the whole idea.